plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution says this was murder, and Sydney had the awareness to hide what she did. The defense says that this was undiagnosed schizophrenia. Now it's going to be up to the jury. On the stand, of course, is the last witness that we expect in this case. It's a rebuttal witness from the state of Ohio. It is a competing expert, psychologist Sylvia Obradovich. She is the state's expert, and she's refuting everything that the 4 defense experts said. Let's go back into court.
You either are or you're not.
And again, on your report, page 16, you start to go into the history of the reports from Summit County Jail and Portage Path, and then you go on to Cleveland Clinic, and kind of summarize essentially all the medical interventions that she had. Again, those reports can speak for themselves. I'm not going to go through all of them. But again, Dr. Obradovich, over and over and over again, Ms. Powell is reporting hallucinations, delusions, and how is it that you just, are you just casting those aside, or just, how do you reconcile your opinion with the fact that she reports over and over and over again these hallucinations and delusions?
A few things. Thing number one, she didn't actually start reporting any of this until she was arrested for the crime, and it was clear that the story of an intruder wasn't going to work. Secondly, when she went to Pez and the Summit County Jail, those records note that she was not acutely psychotic there. And so I understand that she was reporting symptoms to all kinds of people starting on March 4th, but I'm not seeing evidence that she was exhibiting or that they were able to support those symptoms from any collateral reports or observations.
I'd like to take you to the bottom of page 20, middle to bottom. And I know the jury's heard some testimony about this, but you actually here discuss nursing notes.
Yes.
And I've highlighted, you know, telling people she can't wait to get out of here to get a new tattoo, or, you know, comments of the tattoo, and then, you know, starting at the bottom of page 20 and into page 21, you talk about the suture discussion, where she says at first, I don't know who did my sutures, but then she later says, oh, it was a guy and he was a resident. Again, not going to go through every word of those. Why did you include those in your report? Why were those significant?
Similar to what I was saying earlier, is that when you're doing a review of records at a hospital, you have the benefit of having notes from all the disciplines that are providing services. And so I was able to see that, or note here kind of the difference between what happens when she meets with a psychiatrist at the hospital and what happens when she's observed and talking, you know, to nursing staff. And there is a difference.
We see here on page 21, again, some notes that you included in your report. Denies any experiences consistent with psychosis, and then last time she had auditory or visual hallucinations was weeks ago. Having an okay day, just bored. In the middle, regarding her behavior, she appeared to be in some kind of denial or emotionally disconnected from the events leading to admission. Correct. Why are those significant? Why did you include those in your report?
Because again, I think it's just more data that shows how she was observed rather than what she is reporting.
And based on what she is observed, is that consistent with schizophrenia or psychosis?
No.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Sure. When somebody is let's say in a psychiatric hospital and they're acutely psychotic, you're typically going to observe a range of things. It's not the same for each person, but they might be saying things that make no sense, or it kind of makes sense for a minute and then it goes off track and is no longer making sense. You might observe them to speak or interact with things that are not there. If they're exhibiting other symptoms, the negative symptoms where they're just maybe sleeping all day or not interacting with people or they're not really expressing very much, all of those things, if they were observed or noted, could be indications that there's some support here for the reports.
Well, let me ask you about that, because Dr. Timmy testified that in that January and February of 2020, when Sydney was still at Mount Union but was unenrolled, he testified that he used the term avolition. What is
Avolition? That's the fancy word for some of the things I was just explaining. Kind of this lack of motivation, interest, pleasure, and kind of doing anything. So you can just kind of be sitting there in a blank, almost vegetative state, kind of not having any, yeah.
And he testified during that time that Sydney, it was so her, she was, first of all, again, he says prodromal to a psychotic break. I guess a like precursor, kind of in the early stages.
Correct.
That's what prodromal means.
Correct.
And he testified that she was had these avolition symptoms so badly that she couldn't get out of bed, was in her room for 16 hours a day. Was that consistent with the materials you reviewed?
That is not consistent with the materials I reviewed.
All right, page 24, your report. This is kind of, you're getting into your summary of all your findings.
Yes.
You talk about her cell phone records here, that she was skipping class to spend time with friends and prioritized other activities over academics. Why was that your assessment, and why did you include that in your report?
I think one of the things that was a little maybe misleading is that kind of this assumption that if somebody's starting to do poor in school, that must mean they're having a psychotic breakdown. And really, there's lots of reasons you could do poorly in school. And so I think for me, the phone records were showing that she wasn't doing poorly in school because she was having, entering a psychotic episode. She was hanging out with friends, going to sorority parties, skipping class to get food. And so making poor choices about how you spend your time, that could lead to poor performance in school. And so I thought it was important to note that.
And you say in the middle there, based on the totality of the information available, she does not meet criteria for severe mental illness. You say she presents with a problematic pattern that is associated with maladaptive personality. Then you go on to say pattern of emotional instability and lability. Am I reading that right?
It's lability, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, lability. Can you tell the jury what that means?
Basically what that means is it's followed by the words after that. So when somebody is having these brief, intense emotional episodes, we commonly will call that emotional instability or emotional dysregulation or lability, when somebody can be, crying for 5 minutes and then they're okay again. And so that would just be what I was referring to.
And would emotional instability or lability be consistent with a mental disease such that you cannot appreciate the wrongfulness of your acts?
Absolutely not.
And now at the bottom, as we get to the bottom of page 24, would you agree that essentially a sanity, let me ask it this way, is a sanity at the time of the act evaluation, is it essentially two different parts?
That is correct.
Can you explain to the jury what those are?
Yes. So when I'm doing an insanity evaluation, there's two main questions that I have to answer. The first question is, did the person have a severe mental disease or defect at the time of the crime? And then number two, did that severe mental disease or defect prevent them from knowing or understanding the wrongfulness of their actions at the time of the crime?
So, is it possible that someone can have schizophrenia and commit a crime and still know the wrongfulness of their actions?
Absolutely.
Can you explain how that's possible?
Yes. So people can have a mental health problem and something as severe as schizophrenia, but they're still able to decipher right from wrong and understand what they're doing. And so an insanity defense is really limited to not only do you have a severe mental disease or defect, but also that because of that, you didn't appreciate that you were doing something wrong at the time of the crime.
And I know you list here several points that, are you essentially explaining here at the bottom of page 24 why you don't believe she was suffering from schizophrenia?
That is correct. In all of the insanity reports I do, I follow that similar format where I'll give my opinions and then I'll bullet point all the reasons why.
And now you say no history of diagnosis or academic accommodations for an intellectual disability. That's your second bullet point, correct?
That is correct.
Now, it's possible that someone could have no history of psychosis or mental illness and have a first psychotic break, correct?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
In that prodromal period or precursor period, would there commonly be symptoms exhibited?
Yes.
Would those be observable by others?
Yes.
What types of symptoms could those be that would be observable by others?
When I've had that situation happen where unfortunately somebody is having their first episode of schizophrenia and they commit a crime and they don't understand the wrongfulness, usually what we're seeing is when that defendant is interacting with police at the scene of the crime, there'll be notations about kind of odd behavior or saying things that don't really make sense. Family members, friends, roommates, usually throughout all those different data points, you're able to get some support that, oh wow, yeah, this really was the beginning of a psychotic episode.
Well, now that you bring that up, Dr. Radovich, you've also had an opportunity to review the portion of Officer Jackson's body camera where Sydney's on the end of the driveway and she's kind of crying and talking a little bit, and then all of a sudden she just collapses.
Correct.
And she has her head on the ground, she's kind of pawing at the ground.
Correct.
We've heard testimony that that is a visual observation of somebody in a psychotic break. That is catatonia, and we see that in the ambulance, in the hospital, where she just repeats, get out of the house. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do not agree with that.
Can you explain that to the jury why?
Yes, I think it's most reflective of a shock and trauma response that was caused by the actions she just engaged in.
What do you mean by shock and trauma response?
Well, by this time when she's on the pavement in the driveway, she had not that long ago just finished completing the murder of her mother. Police were on the scene. She was trying to say something about an intruder. They were just having her sit, and so she finally kind of had that moment of the adrenaline rush was wearing off, and she was in a state of shock.
Is that the same thing as a psychotic break?
No, it is not.
Is that the same thing as catatonia?
No, actually catatonia is typically, these words are interchangeable. So you can see catatonia as part of a trauma response or shock after going through something horrible. Catatonia can also be a core feature of schizophrenia, but when that's the case, it's not just present for like less than 24 hours and you never see it again. It's typically a hallmark feature that we're seeing over and over with the illness.
And neither prior to the